Good morning.
Good morning.
Looks like our attendance today is 73, and attendance last Sunday was 83. And a year ago, I was told we did not have church. There was a snowstorm. So we ought to be thankful today we are here. Does anyone have a birthday or an anniversary and wishes to contribute to the birthday bank? Anniversary. I'm usually that way. Okay, this morning here at the church, we sent out several cards. We sent a sympathy card to the Ed Dixon family, which most of you know that Ed passed away, I guess it was last week, I think. We sent one to Erica and Nathan York. Erica, we're so sorry about your loss. We know how hard it is. We sent a thanking of you card to Richard and Rachel Nations. Richard's brother, Don, we just got a message a while ago that he passed away this morning. We sent one to Tad and Kim Carnahan. We sent one to Melvin Dixon. Melvin is now at the La Plata Nursing Home in room 103. We sent a get well card to Bridget Lee. She was taken to Kansas City, from what I understand, last night. We do not know why or what, but she is in the Kansas City hospital this morning. So keep them all in your prayers. We have a board meeting here tonight at 7:30. Steve, is that mainly just for the elders? Or do we have much?
It's in reference to the two accounts that we talked about at the last board meeting, just getting them set up.
Yeah, so basically it's just mainly for the board members signing papers to get.
It is, but visas are welcome and they can sign too.
Yep, okay. Also, dinner is today, right after church. Everyone is welcome. It's potluck dinner. It's always good, so stay and enjoy the good food. Trying to see here. Okay, Susan, Chris, you will be taking care of the kids downstairs today. All right. I think that's about everything I've got. Do we have any more announcements this morning? No more announcements? If there is nothing further and I haven't forgot anything, I will turn the services over to Mike.
Can I trust God? Can I trust God? And I'd like to ask, who can I trust? I'm going to throw this out to you. How many think you can trust the government? Okay. How many think you can trust companies? Not really. How about the news? It's always true. How about your neighbors? Can you trust your neighbors? No, probably some of them. How about your parents? That might vary from person to person. Can you trust your friends? Sometimes yes, not so much at other times. Well, here's one that I know we all could trust. How many trust politicians? How many trust your boss? Okay. Can I trust Christian friends? Hopefully we can. We trust our kids. We teach our kids to not trust strangers, don't we? You know, that's one of the things we do with little kids. Don't talk to strangers. Times have changed since I was a kid. I remember on a Saturday, oftentimes, I would get on my little bicycle and I would ride across the city of Council Bluffs to the other side of town to be with my friend who is an elder now in Ottumwa. And we would play all day long. And we would play up in the hills and we would play in the lake and we'd do all kinds of things. Mom and Dad, we didn't have cell phones. Mom and Dad didn't know where we were. But they had trust that we were all right. Well, whether that trust was founded or not, You know, we live in different times today. We really do. Now, you know, you have to be careful to do things like pick up a folded dollar bill on the ground. There was a lady in the news who, or on Facebook somewhere, that she saw this dollar bill on the ground and she thought, well, that'd be a nice little dollar bill to put in my grandson's or grandkids' bank. And she started to pick it up, and she remembered that you can get fentanyl poisoning through your skin, and that a lot of times that's how you get it. Things like that. We have a lot of problems with trust, don't we, in our society. There's creeps online that have profiles that make them look like they're teenagers when they're not, and we've seen a lot of problems with that. There's telephone scams. How many of you ever gotten one of those? I had one just recently that they said I was the clearinghouse sweepstakes winner. And yeah, I wanted to believe it. But I said to him, I said, if that was true, you'd be at least speaking English. You know, there's internet scams, and I've even heard of one of the big things going on now is that these quick deeds that people can fill out and steal your house. There's insurance and all that. You know, there's not a lot of trust in our society right now. But who can I trust? Who can I trust? I know people who have lost their faith over the fact they trusted, say, a religious leader too much, and then when they fell or when they disappointed them, then they were gone. And people, we are fickle. We are fickle. And I don't care who we are, we're not Jesus, and we're not perfect. In the church I came from, I remember one time that I was preaching, and right from this congregation, someone said, "We love you, Mike." And that was embarrassing. A week later, the people left the church because somebody parked in their parking spot. Okay? Are we not, you know, we are fickle as people. We really are fickle. But can I trust God? There's a passage of Scripture in Psalms 9 and verse 10 that says, "Those who know you will trust your name, for you, Lord, have never forsaken those who seek you." There's another passage in the book of Hebrews that says, "Never will I leave you, and never will I forsake you." But this passage is interesting. It says, "Those who know you will trust your name." And so, to become a person who trusts God in our lives, we have to know His name. We have to know Him. And the only way we do that is through time with Him, in the Word and in prayer. Others in life may forsake you. I have met with many people over my lifetime who have told me the stories of dad left or mom left, and they felt forsaken. Many will forsake you, but if you have a good family and a few close friends, you are very fortunate. I was talking to a friend of mine on the phone last week, and this is the conclusion we came to. He said, "You know, Mike," he says, "when it comes right down to it, as we're getting older, it's all about family." And I would include church family. And if you have a couple good friends, and I'm talking about good friends, they're not going to throw you under the bus. They're people you can tell your deepest secrets to. They're not going to judge you. They're not going to gossip. Those are good friends. And if you have one, you are very, very, very fortunate. And so trust is an issue that we need to think about. But God is always trustworthy. How many believe that fact? God is always, always trustworthy. And, you know, I think of that song, and I was going to look it up this morning, but I didn't do that. But the song that says, "Great is thy faithfulness." And I love that song. I've told you that before. But that song, the words of that song is, "Great is thy faithfulness." And He is definitely faithful. And we can trust God. We can trust God. Psalms 56 and verse 3 is going to be my text this morning, and we're going to kind of springboard off of this little short, two little verses. Psalms 56, 3 and 4. Now, I'll give you a little background as to what David was going through when he later wrote this song. He was in the presence of Gath, one of his enemies. He was basically running from Saul. And Achish was the king one of the Philistine kings. And David was terrified for his life, that he thought he was going to be killed by this king. He was kind of in a bad situation. So what did David do? David put on an act. He pretended like he was out of his head. He pretended like he was bonzo, that he was something wrong with it. So the Bible talks about that, and we're going to look at that in a minute, but he feigned insanity. So he started scratching on the wall, it's right in the scriptures, and drooling, and the spittle ran down his beard. And they looked at him for a while, and they said, "What's wrong with this guy?" To make a long story short, he got away from the situation with the help of God. And this is what he writes. He writes this: "When I am afraid, I will trust in you. In God, whose word I praise. In God I trust. I will not be afraid. What can mortal man do to me? What can mortal man do to me?" Every one of us will come to a place in our lives where we experience something that I would call difficult, very, very difficult. And maybe none of you have gone there yet. It took many years for me to come to the place in my life to where I lost somebody in death very close to me, and it was my dad. And before that time, I had never really lost anybody really close. I'd lost some good friends, and I'd done a lot of funerals for friends, but I'd never lost a parent or a child or a sibling or anything of that nature. And when we go through those times, sometimes it's really, really easy for us to ask ourselves the question, "God, why did you let this happen?" And so many times I've talked to people who they will say, "I am mad at God. I'm mad at God." And what they're basically saying is, "I don't trust God." And they'll say something to this nature: if God was really a good God and God was a good person and he has all this power that the Bible claims he has, then why did he let you fill in the blank, die? Or why did he let my business fail? Or what have you? Well, I watched my father age, and then I saw his cancer growing over 10 years. We would take trips with Dad to the doctor, and the doctor said, "We see something on his lungs, but it doesn't seem to be growing, and it's small, and we'll keep our eye on it." So we did for about 10 years. We saw that, and eventually it grew. And he was my responsibility because I was the oldest in the family, and Deb and I lived there with them in the same town. Sisters were in other cities, so Dad was my responsibility. So I had a lot of decisions to make with him and with Mom. And so between myself and the doctor, we decided to just let that go because of his age, that we didn't want to put him through another surgery or a surgery that he may not be the best for him. Well, like I said, 10 years later, he passed. It was really bad, and we didn't do surgery. And at that time, I faced what I had never really faced in life before. And Dad showed me how a man of God faces death. And it's interesting because if you've never faced death yourself, you don't know how you're going to react. At the end of when Dad knew that he was dying, he had several days where he was not himself. And I remember that when he finally realized that I'm not going to make it. Dad was anxious. He was a little brooding. And I said, "What's wrong, Dad?" Because that was not him. If you knew my father, he was very calm and always had a smile, always happy. And I said, "What's going on, Dad?" And what's wrong? You know what he said to me? He said this. He says, "When you know that your time is short, it takes some time to come to grips with your own mortality." I don't care who you are. It takes a little time to come to grips with your own mortality. And soon after those days, he became his old self, and I knew Dad because he was a man of prayer. And this interesting thing about Dad was that he would sometimes pray out loud when I was with him. And he wasn't praying with me, he was praying to God, and I just happened to be there. And he would say things like, "Thank you, Lord. Thank you, Lord. Thank you so much that Mike's here today," or anything, whatever it was. And I mean, it was really interesting that he had that kind of a relationship with God. And so I realized that after he came back to his own self, that he knew where he was going. He'd spent some time with the Lord, and he reinforced in his mind, "Lord, I can trust you, and I know that in your house are many mansions, and one of them's mine." That he knew where he was going. I think he knew somehow, I think God showed him or maybe gave him assurance that mom was going to be okay, that the family was going to take care of her. And with so many people I've been with at this stage in their life, and they have to kind of go through this thing where they're more concerned about their family, their spouse. Are they going to be okay? Are they going to be taken care of when I'm gone? And so on. And I think God gave Dad the assurance, yes, she's going to be okay. That she's going to be taken care of. And I remember that also at that time I had planned a trip to Israel, and I had everything was ready to go, and I said to Dad, "Dad, I'm not going to leave. I don't want to leave when you're in this condition." He said to me, "Mike, you go." He said, "I'll be fine. You go." Well, he died when I was there. I remember getting that phone call halfway across the world when I was in Magdala, where Mary Magdala was from. And over the years, like I mentioned earlier, I have visited with many people who have said, "I am mad at God." It's because they don't know him. You don't know him. And learning to trust God in adversity has been a slow and difficult process for me even. And I'm still working through that, where we learn to have so much trust in God that we don't have a lot of fear. Again, in David, in his time of distress, he chose to trust God. David admitted he was afraid. David was not cocky. He was not arrogant. And despite the fact that he was a warrior of great skill and of great courage, there were times when he was afraid. Like we just mentioned, when the Philistines had seized him at Gath, the historical narrative of that incident says that he was very much afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. But despite David's fear, he said to God, "I will trust you. I will not be afraid." And repeatedly in the Psalms, we find the determination to trust God, choosing to trust him despite all appearances. And again, David declared in another place in Psalms 23 and verse 4, "I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." Remember that in the Psalms 23. It's equivalent to saying, "I will trust in God in the face of evil." In Psalms 16 and verse 8, he says this, "I have set the Lord always before me, because he is at my right hand. I will not be shaken." Well, the same David who said in Psalms 56:4, "In God I trust, I will not be afraid," he also said this in Psalms 34 and verse 4. He said, "I sought the Lord, and he answered me. He delivered me from all my fears. There is no..." And I think to myself, is there a conflict? I say not, between saying I will not be afraid and asking God to deliver me from my fears. He was human. And David recognized that it was his responsibility to choose to trust God, but also that he was dependent upon the Lord for the ability to choose that. Sometimes we go so much on our feelings. And feelings will come up and sneak into you and bring fear to you. What if this happens? What if that happens? And to trust God, we can't go by our feelings, because our feelings will always be wrong. We have to choose. We have to choose. Have to choose. It's a matter of our will. I choose to trust God. And I choose it not on feelings, I choose it on the whole entirety of the scriptures as to what I see he has done throughout history and for people and what he has done for me. But the devil will throw at us little scenarios, and our minds will go nuts, and we will have fear, and we will have anxiety clear over the top, but we have to choose, an act of choosing. It's kind of like somebody that's wanting to get in shape. They don't feel like getting up and going to the gym, but they choose to do that because they know that's what they need to do. There's been times over my life when I was really into that. I would look forward to it all day, and I'd drive to the gym. I'd sit in the parking lot. I'd turn my car back on and leave because I didn't feel like it that day. There's other days that I chose to walk through those doors, and that's what trusting God is awful like. We must also lay hold of some of the great promises of his constant, and I say constant, care for us. One such promise that we do well to store up in our hearts is Hebrews 13:5, where never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. Never. Never. Because God will never leave you, and because he will never forsake you, you are invited, in the words of Peter, and I love this passage in 1 Peter 5 and verse 7, cast all your anxiety on him because he what? He cares for you. He cares for you. And I noticed the word cast, and I hadn't really noticed that before. It doesn't say lay your anxieties on him in 1 Peter 5:7. It says cast. If I cast something, what does that mean? I pick it up and I throw it. I cast it. I throw it. I'm basically saying, Lord, I have anxiety. It's yours. And he can catch. Because he cares for you. And sometimes we lose the sense of God's presence and the sense of his help. But we never lose his presence, and we never lose his help. Job, wow, that's quite a story. In Job, it says, in his distress, he could not find God. He said, but if I go to the east, he's not there. If I go to the west, I do not find him. When he is at work in the north, I do not see him. You know, he was going through so much, Job was. And when he turns to the south, I catch no glimpse of him, but he knows, now listen to this, Job in his faith, in all he'd going through, but he knows the way I take. And when he has tested me, I will come forth as gold. And so sometimes we don't feel God's presence. And that's feelings again. Sometimes it seems like our prayers don't go anywhere. Put yourself in Job's situation. He couldn't figure it out. His friends were trying to help him, and they just made it worse. But Job said, but he knows the way I take. He knows me. And when he has tested me, I came forth as gold. I want to take a look at a couple pitfalls to trust. And then I want to look at a story that I think is amazing. During the times of prosperity and favorable circumstances, we show our trust in God by acknowledging the provider of all these blessings. You know, it's sometimes when you're going through good times and you're being blessed and things are going well, your job's good, your family's good, your health's good, you have a tendency to not trust God during those good times. Because it's all right, I don't need to. You know, he's over here, I'll call on him when I need him. You know? And so God caused the nation of Israel to hunger in the desert, and then he fed them with manna from heaven in order to teach them that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. And of course, Jesus quoted that when he was being tempted by Satan. So how about us with our cupboards and our refrigerators full with food for tomorrow's meals? We are just as dependent upon God as the Israelites were. How many believe that? Even if you have your refrigerator and your stove and your cupboard full of all kinds of stuff. You know, the Israelites was daily, wasn't it? Every day they had nothing to eat until God provided it. Well, God rained down manna for them each day. For us, He may provide a regular paycheck, or He may provide us plenty of food at the supermarket ready for us to buy, hopefully. He provided the Israelites food through a miracle. It was a miracle, and He provides our food through a long and complex chain of natural events in which His hand is visible only in the eye of faith. That eye of faith helps you to realize that I am making it through this day because God has put into effect a complex chain of events that look natural, but it's God that's done it. That I have a job. That I have whatever I need. Whatever I need. And still, and that's a pitfall sometimes, that when everything's going good, we have a problem with trusting God, because I don't need God. But yes, you do need God. You need Him for your next breath. Your next breath, the next heartbeat, only a gift from God. And still another pitfall is trusting God. What we're prone to fall into is to turn to God and trust in the greater crisis experiences of life. You know, when things are really bad, somebody's on life support, and we're in the next room on our knees, and we're just begging God, save them, I need them. But in the smaller catastrophes, in the smaller things of life, we don't necessarily seek Him or trust Him because I can do it. I can handle that. Oh, really? Oh, really? Oh, yeah, I can handle that. We have a disposition to trust in ourselves, and that's part of our sinful nature. It sometimes takes a major crisis, or even a moderate one, to turn us toward the Lord. And a mark of true Christian maturity is to continually, in the good times and the tough times, trust in the Lord in the minutiae of daily life. You may laugh at this. There's times when I say, God, help me find my car keys. You been there? Lord, I know my wallet's around somewhere. It's not here right now. You think God's so piffle. Well, what's wrong with you, Mike? If He's my friend, and He cares for everything, casting all my cares on Him, the big ones, the little ones, why not? But I think that's a pitfall when it comes to trusting Him. But whether the difficulty is major or minor, we must choose. We must choose again, not feelings. I must choose to trust God. We need to learn to say with the psalmist, when I am afraid, I will trust you. Now, I always like to look at examples. I learn more by seeing somebody else's life than just words. Let's turn over to, if you'd like to, turn over to 1 Samuel. And I'm going to start looking in 1 Samuel chapter 13. And this is an interesting story that a lot of times we don't really talk a lot about. But how many of you know who Jonathan is? Jonathan, the son of Saul. And the Bible tells us that Jonathan and David became very, very good friends, even though Saul was really messing up as a king. He had blown it, and we don't have time to go into how he had done that. But he and Jonathan and David were very close. So the Philistines had assembled, verse 5, to fight Israel with 3,000 chariots. The Philistines had 3,000 chariots, 6,000 charioteers. In other words, it looked like there were 2 charioteers for each chariot. And let's not overlook this. That would have been the state-of-the-art fighting equipment back in those days. It would be equivalent to tanks. It would have been equivalent to state-of-the-art armament. You know, powerful jets that we have and so on. And then it goes on, and it says, and soldiers as numerous as the sand on the seashore. And they are estimated that there were probably at least several 100,000 soldiers. Okay? They went up and camped at Michmash, east of Beth Aven. And when the men of Israel saw that their situation was critical and that their army was hard pressed, they hid in caves and they hid in thickets among the rocks and in pits and cisterns. And some Hebrews even crossed the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. They just said, we're out of here. Saul remained in Gilgal, and all the troops with him were quaking with fear, terrified. He waited 7 days, the time set by Samuel, but Saul's did not come to Gilgal, and Saul's men began to scatter. So he's waiting for Samuel to come. You remember that story? Saul went ahead and offered sacrifices on his own, and that was the beginning where God says, I can't use you. I can't use you. I'm looking for a man after my own heart, and so on. And look here in verse number 19. It says, not a blacksmith. Well, before we go there, it says that in verse 15, it says, when Samuel left Gilgal and went up to Gilead in Benjamin, and Saul counted the men who were with him, they numbered about 600. So he had 600 men. Half of his army had taken off and said, we're out of here. We're terrified. Several 100,000 men. And then to make it even worse, look in verse 19. It says, not a blacksmith could be found in the whole land of Israel, because the Philistines had said, otherwise the Hebrews will make swords or spears. So all Israel went down to the Philistines to have their plowshares, mattocks, and axes and sickles sharpened. And it goes on and says that the how much they charged them. So on the day of the battle, verse 22, not a soldier with Saul and Jonathan had a sword or a spear in their hand. Only Saul and his son Jonathan had them. So here you have 600 men, and you have two guys that have a spear and a sword. The other ones had maybe farming equipment or sharpened sticks. It was pretty pitiful. They didn't have anything. And there were only 600 of them. So look in chapter 14. Now, this is where we're talking about trusting in God. This is an example. Out to the pass of Mishma one day, Jonathan, son of Saul, said to the young man bearing his armor, come, let's go over to the Philistine outpost on the other side. But he did not tell his father. And so, verse 4, on each side of the pass that Jonathan intended to cross to reach the Philistine outpost was a cliff. One was called Bozez and the other Seneth. One cliff stood to the north toward Mishma and the other to the south toward Geba. Jonathan said to his young armor bearer, come, let's go over to the outpost to those uncircumcised fellows. Perhaps the Lord will act in our behalf. Nothing, now listen to this. You talk about trust. In this situation, nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few. We are so impressed with numbers, aren't we? By many or by few. Do all that you have in mind, his armor bearer said. You see how courage affects others? Armor bearer said, you know what? I'm with you, man. Go ahead, I'm with you in my heart and soul. Jonathan said, come, then we will cross over toward the men and let them see us. So they were going to actually stand out in the open and let these guys up on this hill, up on this plateau or something, actually looked at them, saw them. If they say to us, wait here until we come to you, we will stay there where we are and not go up to them, and with basically committing suicide. We're here, take us. But if they say, come up to us, we will climb up, because that will be our sign that the Lord has given them into our hands. Trust, ask God to show signs. And trust says, I know you can save through many or through few. So both of them showed themselves to the Philistine outpost. Look, said the Philistines, the Hebrews are crawling out of the holes they were hiding in. The men of the outpost shouted to Jonathan and his armor bearer, Come on up so that we can teach you a lesson. So Jonathan said to his armor bearer, climb up after me. The Lord has given them into the hand of Israel. So Jonathan climbed up using his hands and feet. He had no way to defend himself. With his armor bearer right behind him, that had to have been a sight. These guys are up there rubbing their beards saying, look at this. Can you guys believe these two guys? You think they're nuts? And the Philistines fell before Jonathan, and his armor bearer followed and killed behind him. In that first attack, Jonathan and his armor bearer killed some 20 men, area about half an acre. We don't have time to go into the whole story. But the fact is that the panic struck the whole army. In the camp of the Philistines, with all those men, they fled and they started fighting against each other. And one of the spies from Saul says, hey, what's happening over there? And all of a sudden, whoo! And they all started getting courage. And the guys that were in the caves and in the holes and in the thickets, they come out. And they started, and the people that were all on the other side, they all came back. And there was a terrible rout. 600 men, but 2 guys who trusted in God turned the whole thing around. You think God is happy when we trust Him? We need to learn to trust God. We need to learn to trust God in the small things so that we'll be powerful enough in the big things, because if God be for us, what? Who can be against us? How many believe that? So this year, as we pursue a closer walk with the Lord, we've talked about His incredible grace. How many believe in the grace of God? We've talked about His incredible goodness. Is He a good God? And now He's a God we can trust. You may not be able to trust anyone in this world, but don't to become cynical, because our trust is in God. Our trust is in God.